Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. We'll get started in just 1 minute.
Hello.
Greetings.
Hello, Consul General. I've allowed you to be able to speak. I've taken you off mute, so we'll introduce you in just a moment.
I don't know. 비디오로 그거를 봐야 되는데.
여기 지금 제가 얘기했는데.
Hello, Bill. How are you?
Hello, how are you? Yes.
All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Sarah Spangeman, and I'm the Deputy Director of Communications here at Energy Innovation. Welcome to Pathways to Net Zero in the US and the Republic of Korea, hosted by Energy Innovation and the Consulate General of the Republic of Korea in San Francisco. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. All attendees are on mute, but we do encourage you to put your questions into the Q&A box, and our moderator, Julia, will field those. This webinar is being recorded and will be on Energy Innovation's website tomorrow, and I will drop the link where you can find it in the chat box, and you can also feel free to reach out to me directly for a recording. And now I'm pleased to introduce Julia Piper. Julia is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, which is a nonpartisan organization that galvanizes US global leadership and engagement in partnership with allies and partners. Currently the Vice President of Communication and Policy at the clean energy financing company Lone Pal, but she will be speaking in her capacity as a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council this evening. Before her current role, she previously worked as an editor at Green Tech Media, where she covered the global clean energy transition with a focus on renewable energy, electric mobility, grid edge technologies, and energy policymaking. She's also the host and producer of Political Climate, a bipartisan podcast on energy and environmental issues in America and around the world, presented by USC Schwarzenegger Institute. Ms. Piper covered climate policy for E&E News in Washington, and her writing has also been published in HuffPost, Scientific American, and the New York Times. Thanks, Julia.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you this evening. Over the course of this event, we're going to learn more about the pathways to net zero emissions for both the US and for South Korea. We're going to talk about each country's climate goals. We're going to talk about the policies needed to achieve those targets and how the two countries can work together to meet their goals together and accelerate the clean energy future. To that end, I'm delighted to introduce our panel of experts for this conversation. We're joined by Hal Harvey. He's the CEO of Energy Innovation, one of our hosts for today's event. Of course, Energy Innovation is a US-based independent energy and environmental policy firm. You may have used their Pathways tracker. They've got tons of tools and reports and research that I've had the privilege of engaging with over the years and real of value to this sector. For Hal's history, from 1991 to 2001, he served as founder and CEO of the Energy Foundation, a philanthropy supporting policy solutions that advance renewable energy and energy efficiency. He then helped establish the Energy Foundation's China, as well as European Climate Foundation and the Indian Sustainable Energy Foundation. He also served as the Environment Program Director at the Willem and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Mr. Harvey has served on energy panels appointed by Presidents Bush and Clinton, and has published 2 books and dozens of articles on energy and national security issues. He has countless other titles and awards we could go into. We won't have time to mention, but it's so great to be with you tonight, Hal.
Thank you.
Also, we are joined tonight by former Governor of Colorado, Bill Ritter. He's also the founder and director of the Center for the New Energy Economy at Colorado State University. He's the author of the 2016 book entitled Powering Forward: What Everyone Should Know About America's Energy Transition. As governor of Colorado, Mr. Ritter built consensus to tackle some of the biggest challenges in the state. During his 4-year term, he established Colorado as a national leader, an international leader in clean energy by showing how to build a truly new energy economy. Governor, it's nice to be with you. And then finally, we have Dr. Sangwon Kim. He's assistant professor of electrical engineering at, excuse my pronunciation here, Cheongnam National University. Dr. Kim's research focuses on decarbonization and the decentralization of the electric grid. He's a board member of Korea Energy Agency, the government agency tasked with supporting the energy transition. He's also a member of the Hydrogen Economy Council of South Korea under the Prime Minister's office. Additionally, he leads the NEXT group, an independent think tank focused on Korea's energy transition. The NEXT group is currently working on an energy modeling project out to 2050 that will also work on the industry sector specifically and aligning that with net zero emissions. Now, those are our panelists for later in the discussion, but first I have the honor of introducing our first speaker of the evening, Consul General Yoon from the Consulate General of the Republic of Korea in San Francisco. Sir, would you please provide our opening remarks for today?
Good afternoon, distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure to make remarks on the occasion of a webinar titled Pathway to Net Zero in the US and the Republic of Korea. First of all, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to Mr. Hal Harvey, the CEO of Energy Innovation, for organizing today's important event. And I also appreciate very much the prominent panelists today, the Governor Bill Lither, the former governor of Colorado and director of the Center for New Energy Economy at Colorado State University, and Dr. Sangwon Kim, the assistant professor at Chungnam National University in Korea, and also the moderator, Ms. Julia Piper, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much for joining this important seminar. We are facing unprecedented climate change, and there is a pressing need for immediate action. President Biden, after being a new US president, declared to rejoin the Paris Agreement, and he's now leading the global coalition to tackle challenges ahead. At the climate summit 2 weeks ago, the US government made a commitment to 50 to 52% cut in greenhouse gas emission by 2030 and the net zero emissions by 2050. Korea has also joined the global efforts to fight against the climate change, and for example, last year pledged ambitiously to go carbon neutral by 2050. At a recent climate summit, the President Moon made an announcement that the South Korea would hold the state-backed financing of coal-fired power plants overseas, and also plan to strengthen its emissions reduction commitment in accordance with Paris Agreement. And Korea will host the second P4G summit on May 30 to 31st this year in Seoul, virtually, to catalyze public-private partnership for promoting green growth across the globe. Against this background, I believe that today's webinar could be very much timely and useful, and the discussion today give us some policy guidance in response to the climate crisis. As you know, it is urgently requested for our two nations to find common ground for cooperation in such strategic sectors as a hydrogen economy, electric cars and batteries, and the renewable energies. It is our understanding that the President Biden's Green New Deal could be suitably matched with the President Moon's new policy of Green New Deal initiative. It would be very much great if the panelists can present the directions or policy suggestions for our two countries' industrial cooperation in those fields. Once again, I hope that today's webinar could provide the policymakers of both countries with opportunities to learn from each other and seek ways to promote cooperations in Green New Deal sectors. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Consul General Yoon. So now we are going to turn to some more introductory remarks from our panelists, and then we'll turn to a more dynamic conversation after that. Just as a reminder, as we move forward, please put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to those over the course of this discussion. So let's turn now to Dr. Kim to provide an even more detailed overview of Korea's plans to reach net zero.
Sarah, can you share my slide on the screen? Okay, let me start. First of all, I'm very honored to present the overview of net zero plan of Korea as a representative of Republic Korea. Actually, I'm recently designated as a commission member of newly launched Carbon Neutrality Commission in South Korea, which is the presidential advisory body. So because of it, I need to clarify that the views and opinions expressed in this material not reflect the official position of the Korean government. Yeah, go to the next slide. And the next. Yes, the last year and this year are very important for pathway to the net zero of South Korea. Actually, there was not official discussion on net zero goal at the early of the last year. At February 2020, the Low Carbon Society Forum submitted 5 scenarios for 2050 LEDS for UN submission. LEDS means long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategy. But it looks quite far from the 2050 net zero goal indeed. The most ambitious scenario among the 5 scenarios said only 75 reduction at 2050 from emission level of 2017. The following after the net zero pledge from the China and Japan, the President Moon also pledged to have the Korea achieve the carbon neutrality by 2050 at October of the last year. After that, the National Council of Climate Change, which is shortly NCCA, led by Mr. Kim Eun-pan, the former UN Secretary General, recommended that the government adopt the core phase out of year of 2045 or earlier, and also should consider the 2040 or earlier, the core phase out year for achievement of net zero goal. This goal of the NCCA is based on the long public discussion process with the public. Yeah, please go to the next page. Yeah, at November of the last year, the Congresswoman So Young-lee proposed a bill for enacting the fundamental law of net zero goal of South Korea, including the establishment of strong governance. Finally, at the April of this year, the cabinet of the President Moon approved a plan to set up the Carbon Neutrality Commission. This newly launched organization will start to discuss the Korea's official net zero plan and scenarios from this year. Until then, we have not official scenarios or plan at all, unfortunately. Yeah, next page. However, we easily know that it is very clear that we have to overcome the following challenges to achieve net zero goal in the South Korea. The first one is the heavily carbon intensive generation mix of Korea currently. We have about the 40% of coal and the 30% of gas in the generation mix. It also affects the scope 2 emission of industrial sector. Next page. The second challenge is the still continuing core financing, which is related to the first challenges. Korea spent more than 12 billions of US dollars for core financing in the 2019, including the 7 new core power plants under construction and other overseas core projects. For the first step of net zero plan, the President Moon made a vow to end new funding for overseas core project at the last climate summit. Next page. And the next page. And the third challenge is increasing the social conflict on the renewable energy in the local area. Even if the renewable installation was conducted very well, according to the government official plan, but the local conflict is continuously increasing until now. It will be a very critical point, I think, for the further expansion of renewable energy in the South Korean landscape. And the next page. The last one is the carbon-intensive industry of the South Korea. This is more tough challenges for the South Korea. As you know, the Korea has the manufacturing-dependent economy and it is one of the main countries for making various energy-intensive products. For example, the steel and the refined product and the chemical product and semiconductors. Yeah, next page. This industrial sector emission are taking up 37% of the nation's total emission, considering the scope 1 only. Scope 2 emission is also critical for the semiconductor or electronics sectors, as depicted in the right side figure. When you effectively reduce the scope 2 emission, it can be quite big achievement in some sectors, as described in the figure. Yeah, go to next page. Yeah, from this page, it's my own opinion as the one person in the academia. I think the urgent mission of Korea toward net zero is decarbonization of the power sector. We have to phase out the all coal power plants before 2035. The below is my recent research, which has proved the coal plants in the South Korea cannot survive anymore after 2030 in the Korean electricity market. This is stemmed from the technical inflexibility of the coal power plants in the renewable-oriented power system in the future and more strengthened environmental regulation. As an alternative of coal, we have to prepare more renewable than the current goal of government to 20% at the 2030. To do this, we need more storage. Because our power system is not connected to other countries and other power systems, we have to absorb any problems from the renewable through the huge volume of energy storage without any help from the neighboring system. Currently, I'm the working group member of preparing the storage portfolio with the Ministry of Energy. We are making the optimal storage mix for the future to support the efficient integration of renewable energy. Finally, we have to consider the importing the green hydrogen from the overseas because there is not sufficient renewable energy potential in the domestic area. When you consider the land use in South Korea, you know, we have very small land compared to the United States and any other European countries. In order to fully achieve the net zero goal, even in the industrial sector, a very top sector, engagement of the major industry is very essential. Oh, please go to the next page. Yeah, currently the many giants and the many chaebol company saying the many commitments about the 2050 carbon neutrality, but it looks very still conservative and ambiguous compared to our clear goal of the net zero in the nation level. Yeah, next page, please. I think there are the many things to do from now, but the most important and urgent thing is to make the strong governance for the real implementation of net zero scenarios in the South Korea, especially in the government and the National Assembly and the Blue House and each industrial leadership level. Yeah, this is all of my short overview of the Korean net zero plan. Actually, we have not official plan, but we have many things to do from now. Thanks for listening, and other details may be discussed in the next section. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Kim. Now we're going to turn to Hal Harvey for a similar presentation from the US perspective.
Thank you, Julia. I will not use slides, but will speak. And thank you, Dr. Kim, for an outstanding presentation. I had a chance to read your slides before our meeting, and they're filled with information. Very useful. And Consul General Yoon, it's nice to see you again, and I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation. So this is politically and institutionally and economically in America, the moment when we really turn strongly to clean energy is underway. One important point that governs all of this is perhaps most of the energy decisions in America are made state by state. And we'll hear from Governor Ritter, who is a leader as a governor and ever since in the clean energy transition. But states control utility regulations, building regulations, often automobile standards, and sometimes appliance and equipment standards. So states are absolutely crucial to this transition. Luckily, most of them are shooting ahead with strong commitments. All that said, just before the climate summit hosted by President Biden, the United States released the elements of its nationally determined contribution, its NDC, and its pathway to get to zero net carbon by 2050. The summary is 15 pages long. There are many, many things in it. And it's a mix of standards, but especially it's organized around incentives for innovation and especially incentives for deployment. And one of the important aspects of this is with almost any technology, but certainly clean energy technologies, deployment is innovation. The more you deploy, the more you learn, the greater your economies of scale, the better your business models, and so forth. So the plan is not only to drive the specific changes, but also to reinvent or reprice, I should say, the technologies that can create a clean energy future. From my perspective, the best way to think about energy policy is sector by sector. What does the electricity sector need to do to go to zero carbon? What about transportation? What about buildings? And what about industry? Because they have different pathways, different technologies, different economics, and emphatically different policy options. So I'll walk quickly through pathways to zero in these four sectors and what's in the NDC plan. I will try to point out opportunities for US-Korean cooperation along the way, because I think that's where the real power comes in. First, I need to commend Korea on both its ambitious goal and its immediate commitment to stop coal finance. Those are very important steps, and they were heard around the world. Countries and experts all over understand this is going on. In the electricity sector in the United States, the interim goal that most people are arguing for is 80% reduction by 2030. And I'm a big fan of targets that land us in 2025, 2030, and 2035, because those are ones you can plan for. If you focus solely on 2050, it's easy to delay, and we cannot afford delay. Governor Ritter has been leading a process which he may speak about, bringing a lot of utilities along to these ambitious goals. In the Biden plan, this is mostly achieved through tax credits for solar and wind, but also through reforming over time the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which has hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of projects that it needs to approve that it has not approved. Reforming our transmission organizations. Electricity transmission is an almost magical way in a big country of smoothing out the fluctuations of clean energy. I sometimes call the Biden plan on electricity a synthetic clean energy standard. But he does call for a clean energy standard as well. The numbers are not established. The electricity transition is well underway. It's accelerating incredibly quickly. It also enables all the other transitions. Because if you have an electric car powered by a zero carbon grid, you have zero carbon automobiles. The same goes for an electric house or electrified industry. So we sometimes say, decarbonize the grid and electrify everything. I think in the past 10 years, we've cut our coal use in half, and I think we'll cut it in half again in the next 10 years. No more coal in America. I understand the situation is quite different because we have an infinity of natural gas as a transition fuel and lots of land for solar and wind. And it's harder in South Korea. One element where Korea could make a fantastic advance is in offshore wind. The United Kingdom and Germany especially are pursuing offshore wind with vigor. Offshore wind blows much more continuously than onshore wind. The price is dropping quickly, and they've learned to float them, so there's less installation costs in deep seas. I think Korea has the industrial capability to become a global leader in offshore wind, one of maybe 2 or 3 in the whole world. And it would be a fantastic electric grid transition strategy. Let me move to the other sectors, to the transportation. The future of the automobile and of delivery trucks already is upon us, and it is already electrification. And even for long haul trucks, electrification is becoming more and more viable. Korea is a huge manufacturer of vehicles, very advanced, sophisticated vehicles, as good as any in the world. And I'm seeing more and more electric vehicle offerings from Hyundai, Kia, and so forth. That said, there will be, certainly in America, some of the industries will drag their feet, will go very slowly. It's important that they go quickly for 3 reasons. First of all, cars last a long time. So if you put out a brand new gasoline powered car today, it will be polluting the atmosphere for 15 or 20 years. Second, early deployment means cost prices go down. And the third, again, for Korea, you have LG Chem and Samsung battery manufacturing. I think Korea probably has the most advanced battery manufacturing in the world, certainly in the top 3. An amazing opportunity for accelerating that transition and owning a big part of it. The battery business will be as big as the car business in the not very distant future, I think. Let me turn to buildings. I'm a big fan of heat pumps. They give you 4 units of heat for every unit of electricity. And they're based on existing technologies, but there are fantastic opportunities to make them more efficient, quieter, but more cost effective, easily reversible, so they are air conditioners in the hot summer. And I think it's time to end thermal heat of buildings and instead use, so no more burning of gas or coal or oil to heat up buildings, but instead using a zero carbon electricity combined with a heat pump to get the efficiency. There is not much in the Biden plan to do this. I think this will happen more state by state, but there are some opportunities with tax credits, with R&D, and with early deployment that will come out of, I believe will come out of the Biden plan when it's done. Last, to turn to the question of industry. This is the hardest sector. And it's not really fair to call it a sector because it's steel and aluminum and chemicals and fertilizers and pulp and paper and cement and so on. What we really need is a pathway for each of the top 6 or top 8 industrial sectors. How do you make low carbon steel? The Swedish government has made a hydrogen powered steel mill that costs 30% more but has 0 emissions. 30% sounds like a lot, but when you embed that in a car, it's just a couple $100 out of a $40,000 car. Korea is probably the most manufacturing dependent economy on earth. This was in your slideshow, Dr. Kim. So it would be very smart for both countries to vigorously pursue the R&D to make hydrogen-based manufacturing, to reinvent chemistry so it's made with carbohydrates instead of hydrocarbons. Each of these needs an expert-driven pathway. Each will need tax credits or R&D. Each will need early deployment assistance, but each will have a fantastic opportunity in the competitive market if they're pursued vigorously and successfully. So to wrap it up, I would say both countries need to become clearer and more determined in each of the four sectors, each of the four energy sectors. We need to look across the Pacific Ocean and also to Europe and China, of course, to find partners for some of the difficult problems like the manufacturing pathways. We need to scale up battery production. We need specific policies to restrict the sale of and phase out the internal combustion engine. We need to stop building internal combustion engine cars. And we certainly need to stop building coal plants globally and shutting down the oldest, dirtiest ones first, but on a steady march to eliminate them. I think if this is done properly, it will be good for our economies. It will be good for jobs. It will be good for those people who still breathe air, as they will get cleaner air. And maybe most important, it'll give us a chance to avoid really serious, catastrophic even climate change. So again, thank you for this opportunity, and I very much look forward to hearing from Governor Ritter and the discussion.
Well, I'm glad to know there's a chance, Hal. Thanks for putting it in those terms. Governor Ritter, let's bring you into the conversation. I'd love to just start with getting your reactions to what's been said so far and bringing in some of your expertise.
Thanks, Julia. And I'd like to offer my own thanks just for the privilege of being here. Hal and I go back a long way, so it's always good to be with Hal Harvey and with his deep subject matter expertise, but it's also an honor, General Counsel, to be with you, even if it's virtually, and Dr. Kim, to hear your presentation and be able to respond to it. I'm humbled by that. So thank you very much. I appreciate this opportunity. So what Hal said, I run a policy center at Colorado State University that for the last 10 years has worked with states. Now I'm doing some work at the federal level as well. I just want to give you a sense about some of the evolution that we've seen over the last decade. And it has to do with how states embrace the idea of setting standards for what utilities had to do in the power sector. And some of this translates to the other harder to decarbonize sectors. But in the power sector, states said, okay, we regulate utilities, many of the utilities, so we're going to require them to have a certain amount of renewable energy on their grid as part of their portfolio by a year certain. And the years varied and the amount varied, but Colorado was one of the states who went from 10%, 20%, 30%, and the 30% mark was by 2020. So in doing that, what we also did was take advantage of the build out of economies of scale. And so while I was governor, we went from 10 to 20 to 30, and the price from the time I left office until the present time, the price of solar has been reduced about 90%, price of wind about 85%, and the price of storage as well, 85 to 90%. And so we created this economy that started really with a policy-based use of levers that ultimately creates these economies of scale. And now, because the market dictates, we are shutting down the coal in Colorado. There will be virtually only one coal plant left after 2030. Those announcements have been made. And I use Colorado as an example because that experience has been replicated around the country. When I was governor, I think there were 29 or 30 states that had renewable portfolio standards. And so the markets that have been created by that policy lever, along with some other complementary policies, has really caused the utility sector now to look at the end of coal, much as Hal talked about. So 62 major utilities in the United States have now set significant goals of emissions reduction. And one of our utilities in Colorado, it operates in 7 states, but it's the biggest in Colorado, says it can reduce its emissions from 2005 by 85% by 2030. It believes that it now has 30% renewables, and by 2025, it'll be 55 to 66%, 55 to 60% renewables. And I use them as an example because they are just that, they're an example. They're bold, but other utilities and major utilities who 10 years ago would not have entertained the idea of announcing the rapid shutdown of coal have said it's not just something that's kind of the right thing to do to take our emissions down, it's the right thing to do for our shareholders as well. It really is a market-based decision. And so we've got these announcements. The Biden administration would like the utility sector, the power sector, to get to 80% reduction by 2030 of its emissions. And there are many in there that believe they are able to do that. There are others that believe that's going to be a real stretch for them. One of the things we found with the power sector is if you give them a goal, they're likely to tell you it's going to be tough to meet and then overperform and then meet it. That's been a good part of the experience of working with the power sector. The other part of this is they will also say, we don't exactly know how we're going to get to net zero. And the Biden administration has a 2035 goal of net zero for the power sector. And they're asking the power sector to do more than the other sectors for just the reasons that Al described and Dr. Kim that you described, how difficult it is to really understand what it's going to take to get to net zero in the other sectors beyond the power sector. I believe the transportation sector is going to probably outperform as well, just given many of the announcements we've had from the big automakers in America and the kinds of things they're urging the administration to do to try and incentivize the purchase and the ability to charge electric vehicles. But back to the power sector, they don't know what that last part's going to be, but for the last 2 days, I've hosted a conference on the clean energy transition. And my first speaker that I had to facilitate a conversation with is Gina McCarthy. She is the president's policy advisor on climate who stood up a new office in the White House. She was formerly the administrator at the EPA, the head administrator at the EPA under the Obama administration. And what she said was, we don't need to know right now what's going to take us all the way to net zero, but we need to lean in today as states, as local governments, in the private sector and the federal government. We need to begin doing everything we can today. So the CEOs of utilities in the power sector are saying, we have to do these things to hit these emission goals. We have to take down as much coal as quickly as possible. In part, it's non-economic, but it also is the biggest emitter. And so we have to take that down. And while we don't know how to hit that last 20 or 15% of emissions reduction to get us to net zero, we have to build out massive amounts of renewable. We have to modernize the grid so that it can accept massive amounts of renewable, so that it can talk back and forth to customers. We have to incentivize energy efficiency measures. And interestingly, a conversation that has happened in the last couple of years in America, but I think was magnified by some of the racial issues, racial justice issues in the United States. We have to do it in an equitable way. We have to do it in a way where we ensure that we're treating marginalized communities fairly, and where we still have polluting resources in place. They're not just in places where people are poor, or people are people of color, or people are indigenous people. So that's all part of the conversation. And I'm very much in the camp of Hal Harvey and Dr. Kim of saying, this isn't just about technology. And I think, Dr. Kim, you said there's still, not necessarily a social license to operate renewable plants. There's not popular acceptance of that. There's social science involved in this. There's, behavioral changes necessary for us to do what we're going to have to do to really mount the changes for climate. So one of the things the Biden administration suggested, and it actually came from the university I'm at. I can't take credit for it. It's not my idea, but I was the conduit to the campaign, and it is to develop an advanced project research agency dedicated to climate. And we have had that for energy. It was very technology driven. We've had it for the Department of Defense. It was called DARPA. But their idea is to do this for climate and really to stand up this advanced agency. And our idea at CSU is to do this with a multidisciplinary approach that also involves the social sciences that allow us to think about behavioral changes, because we need technical innovations to get to that last part in all the sectors. We're going to need technical innovations in a serious way to get to net zero, but we're going to have to also get to a place where people will widely accept that we're in a transition. There's an urgency to the transition. Their lives can be impacted by that transition, and that will all be a part, not only of the future, but the near future. It's a part of the next decade, of the next 2 decades, and the next 3 decades. And so thinking about it that way, I'd like to think that the cooperation that we can do comes from, I think, the relationships that we already have. And I'm in Colorado, where we have the National Renewable Energy Laboratory that's already established a relationship with South Korea and is doing work with Korea. I'm not intimately familiar with that work, but I talked to the researchers a little bit about kinds of things that they're trying to do. And it very much involves the industrial sectors and trying to think about how to partner in decarbonizing the industrial sector. But I think there are many opportunities like that to look at where policy levers can make a difference, to look at where that makes a difference with economies of scale, and the need to build out the transmission system so that as a power island, you can take full advantage of the modernization, and that helps you take full advantage of the ability to integrate renewables into it. I again totally agree with Hal that offshore wind is something that can be explored and we hope increased. Our eastern seaboard, a lot of those states were saying on the eastern seaboard, we don't have really the capacity to do renewables, but we've not developed the potential for offshore wind, and we're beginning to do that now, and it makes a very big difference in what their portfolios will look like going forward. So I think I'll end there, again, with just a note of thanks that I had the chance to comment, and happy to be a part of the further discussion.
Great. All right. Thank you so much. One of the things I'm taking away is we don't have to have all the answers now. We have enough of the answers now. Let's get going. And we have all these tools at our disposal and potentially some new ones we can bring in to accelerate this work.
I really like the way she said it, Julia. I'll just give you this. She said, we need to lean forward into the future. Just lean into it. And that was a great, I think, optic for me to think about how we should all be leaning forward, thinking about the future without knowing the answers right now.
I love that. Lean forward into the future. Okay, I got to write that one down. Consul General, I just wanted to take a moment to turn back to you in case you had anything to comment on here. Don't want to put you on the spot, but any additional thoughts before we move into our Q&A?
First of all, thank you very much for your for the panelists' excellent presentation, and also the Governor Peter's the explanation about his experience as a governor to tackle the introducing renewable energies. One question I have is, in case of Korea, there is a strong need for solar panel installment, and the government has sponsored and give incentives to install solar panel. But the one problem is that available land is very limited, and mostly in the mountainous area or hilly side in the city. So in that case, during the summer monsoon season, when there is a typhoon came, that there is a threat of landslide in Korea. So there is some the opposition or kind of local people's opposition to install the solar panels in the hilly area. So do you have any experience or how to tackle these kind of problems when you install the solar panel in the hilly area? So I would like to ask the governor, Bill Little.
So it's quite mountainous in Colorado, but we are also in a more arid place. So the issue around landslides, and actually Hal Harvey comes from Colorado, so it's his home state and my home state are the same, and he could probably answer this as well as I can. But one of the things on land use challenges that we've looked at, and we have a lot of open land here, so we're very, very fortunate that way. We've also looked at using, parking garage roofs for it, and just housing roofs, commercial building roofs. Just thinking about ways not to make it a land use issue, but instill doubling down on, building space and trying to use it that way. And again, with the technology, the kind of technology developed about really the ability to speak to those systems, that's really very helpful. One of the problems with building too much solar in the mountains, if you do it at utility scale, then you have to build transmission over it. And that's a difficult challenge for us to build out new significant transmission in the mountains. So our population center, and it's really about 85% of the people who live in Colorado live about 30 miles from a major interstate that runs north and south. And we really focused on that as the area where we build out utility scale. And we have community solar too, where people can participate in a community plot and actually own part of that community plot. But we have also tried to focus on how to do that utilizing space that's already occupied with parking garages, parking lots, and other kinds of buildings. Hal, do you want to?
Yeah, just to add a couple words. When you put solar where the demand is, you save a lot of money because you don't have to move the electricity with transmission lines and so forth as much. Basically require every roof every big roof, every factory, every department store, every transshipment area to have solar on top, but make it easy. Give them a 10-year power contract, give them permits very quickly, give them design help if they need it. In residential solar in Germany costs half as much as residential solar in America because they paid attention to the soft costs, marketing, permitting, and so forth. So you really want it to be a glide path. Every parking lot, if you put a solar panel on it, is a bonus because it's now a covered parking lot, so it doesn't get too cold or too hot. But there's no question Korea will have to design special policies. One other idea is most rural towns are economically suffering compared to the cities. And if you can build in the rural areas, it can be a jobs creator. It can help with economic equity. So oftentimes people's resistance will be smaller if it comes with a good job.
Yeah.
One of the things many of the states are considering is in their development of building codes, states have a lot of responsibility for building codes, is to require that any new build be compatible with the installation of rooftop solar. And that can be residential, it can be commercial, but it is something under consideration, sort of, again, as a lever of forcing sort of the build out of solar and building it out in places where you don't have to use open space or unused land.
Great. Well, I want to bring in Dr. Kim again here. So I'll bring in a question actually from Marian Hitt in our Q&A. So she said she spent time in Korea with civil society advocates there working to phase out coal. She's thankful for the leadership. Her question is, how can the US and Korea best work together to accelerate that progress? She also then adds, can we work together to minimize the expansion of gas in both countries as well, and specifically US gas going to Korea? Dr. Kim, do you have thoughts on that? Accelerating coal and then addressing the gas piece.
You're muted.
Sorry,
there. Thank you.
The most challenging thing and the most controversial issues related to the coal phase out in the South Korea is the technical issues. So many people, especially in the engineer group, worry about the power system reliability and the stability when we need to phase out all coal power plants and the old LNG power plants. So I think this is a very big change for the power system perspective. We have to totally change our whole power system with new technologies without any help from the conventional generator. But I think this is the matter of cost. This is just not the matter of technology, because technology is already prepared in the two countries. I think this is a matter of cost, so we can handle it in terms of technologies. However, the Korea is not prepared to cover these big changes in terms of the market and the regulatory structure. The cost of transition should be delivered to the end user finally, but our electricity tariff level is being pushed down by political reason and very other something. So I think the best way to work together between the US and Republic of Korea is to share the experience about the market reform, the regulatory reform, to be ready for the big changes. Yeah, that is my opinion.
Maybe Hal, then building off of that, what are some of the market reforms you think need to happen here in the US? You mentioned FERC. There's all kinds of discussion we can have there about bringing in distributed energy into wholesale markets. You mentioned transition. What are some of the things the US is doing on market reform?
So let me start with the technical side of this question. I studied power systems engineering at Stanford, and we were taught to turn on big power plants and leave them on for years at a time, and to turn on medium ones for seasons and small ones for daily loads. Pretty simple, actually. The new paradigm when you have a renewables intensive grid is about system optimization rather than baseload power plants. And the system includes lots of things. It includes wind and solar. Offshore wind has a different timing and capacity factors compared to onshore wind. There's some dispatchable renewables like hydro and geothermal. Nuclear can be dispatchable. Biomass, perhaps. So, and then even within the renewables side, in California, we move a lot of our solar panels so they face west because we need the energy most late in the day when the air conditioning loads are highest. And then there's solar thermal, those solar farms that that concentrate energy on a power station. That's on the supply side. On the demand side, there's a huge opportunity with demand response. Basically, giving people different rates depending on when they use electricity, or even having certain energy shut off. If it's going to be a very hot day in Houston, for example, you can pre-cool the buildings by 2 or 3 degrees, from 3 in the morning to 6 in the morning, and then you don't have to run them near the air conditioners as often in the late afternoon. The territory of demand response is unexplored. And then finally, then there's batteries getting better and better. The bigger your transmission lines, the easier everything smooths because you can move jobs around, you can move electricity around. So the utility operators have to move into a system optimization perspective. And to the specifics of your question, Julia, regulation has to also help guide them there. So utilities need to be given incentives for performance, not for investment. And the performance should include price. It has to have reliability as paramount. And that can be measured in single-digit minutes per year, very, very tight standards. So clean, reliable, safe, and affordable. Those are the 4 goals. Rewarding utilities and power companies to the extent they meet those 4 goals is, I think, what's necessary. There are big opportunities, but it requires a mind shift first, and then after that, utility structure shift. Let me stop there.
To that?
Yeah,
Yeah, just because
you to that. And can you also just add how we get there? I'd love to get more specifics on who owns this and gets it done, but please go ahead.
Well, I think Dr. Kim, one of the things that I would say, I think you asked the question, but there are utilities that are further ahead than others, and it's very much what Hal said. So I just want to amplify the point, not to change anything that he said, but utilities, they have modeling inside their own staff. And they used to model loads and think, okay, and in March, we're going to need this much, or in the second week of March, we may need this much power. And now they've had to become more granular, and they have to actually model it in a very, very, very sort of tight way, day by day and hour by hour. And they have to include in that places that are feeding onto the grid that didn't exist 10 years ago. Distributed generation, rooftop solar, and looking at the advent of more electric vehicles coming our way, and the ability of the electric vehicle to feed so it's become a very sophisticated job for utilities to do, but they've done it. And I would say a place of intersection for the Republic of Korea and the United States is to borrow from the experience of utilities who probably 10 years ago were modeling in a very different way and maybe closer to where the Republic of Korea is now. But because they've really had to make this transition, they will tell you that they use all of the things Hal said. They use time of day pricing, they use tiered pricing, they use demand side management and other kinds of ways. And they're using sort of the way that we can feed onto the grid with electric vehicles or other kinds, and with solar panels and things of that nature, all to say we're modeling it home by home and building by building, but we have, 15 minutes ahead, we know what load we will need because our modeling has gotten so much better.
Yeah, that's interesting. So what I'm taking away from that is that utilities are having to respond to the energy transition as it is playing out. It's like the new technologies are coming, so they're having to deal with this. I think what's interesting is then the new element of consumers as they get more control and have more tools at their disposal, they're demanding things. And then of course we have the climate layer as well. But I think it's interesting to try and connect big Biden level goals with, as Hal said, these are all state by state locality decisions as well. So I'm always curious at the end of the day, who owns this, who gets it done here in the US, and I'm sure it's similarly abroad. Okay, let's turn back to some of our questions. Maybe going back to Dr. Kim again, you mentioned the need for battery storage in South Korea. You also said you work on hydrogen. Emma Crow-Willard's asking, battery versus hydrogen, where are the pros and cons? Why and when would we use one or the other? So if you could answer that from the Korean perspective, and then we'll think about it from the US lens too.
I think this is very controversial issues in the South Korea currently. Yeah, because hydrogen and hydrogen storage is quite expensive now, so it is not the competitive technology until now. But I think in terms of very long term perspective, we have to get the. Where's the question? Yeah,
I just cleared it. Yeah, okay. It was basically. What are the benefits and drawbacks of each of the resources?
Yeah. So we have to have the both of these two technologies, because someone estimates we need 900 gigawatts for 100 renewable transition in the South Korea without any help from the neighboring countries. So, but I think the 900 gigawatts is not a feasible number when you consider the limited land use in the South Korea. So, but the Korean government estimates 300 considering economic feasibility and the land use problem, and when you consider the renewable energy installation and the feasible installation. So there's huge gap between these two numbers. So the main difference between these two numbers is the existence of storage. So when you use the more storage and the more battery, then we can get the 100% renewable goal more easily. But I think if we get more help from the hydrogen technology, we need more. We can more easily get there. So we need two technology both.
Hal, what would you say about the opportunity for hydrogen in the US, how that interplays with battery storage? Again, the idea here, needing to store the energy to complement renewables. How are you thinking about that?
So I would say you segregate them by use. You're never going to fly a big plane very far with batteries. It's not going to happen. but you could with hydrogen. When you rethink chemical processes, hydrogen is already a substantial chemical input, and there's much more you can do. And you cannot do that with electricity. So you start with some of the very tough realms like that, maybe big ships too. You can't do that with solar. The energy balances don't work. For hydrogen to become more than highly specialized, it has to become a lot cheaper, 4 to 10 or more times cheaper. And there's two or three tricks to that. One of them, which we've already accomplished, which is to make solar incredibly cheap. The next big trick is to make electrolyzers incredibly cheap. And there are some fantastic technologies under development that I think can do that. They're on a learning curve. That learning curve can be accelerated. And then you need to think about whether you can have sort of lightly compressed or seriously compressed storage. But if electrolyzers are cheap, then hydrogen production can be a load following business. You can run your electrolyzers during low demand times and turn them off during high demand times. So they become system balancers. If your electrolyzers are expensive, you cannot do that because the economics don't pencil out. So getting electrolyzers cheap is crucial for this. With batteries, almost everybody in the world underestimated the potential of lithium-ion batteries. It's been quite incredible. The price has been the most incredible side. The performance has roughly doubled, but price has dropped around 90%. There's a lot of work on solid state batteries that's underway. So I think we're going to start seeing performance numbers catching up. But even at today's performance levels, the clever packaging, the clever battery management systems, the lower cost production, the gigafactories are all changing the prospects of what we thought was possible. I mean, in 5 years, we're where we thought we would be in 2035, just 5 years away from our last set of projections. So I would just divide it up by use.
I guess, Governor Ritter, I'd like to get your thoughts on this. I'm going to eventually go back to a question here from Julian Spector on the safety of batteries, which relates to a specific incident in Korea. I'll actually just put this out here. He's saying, Korea had issues with battery fires after a government incentive a few years ago. How has that affected government thinking on energy storage, and what will be different in future development? Dr. Kim, I'll go to that in a minute, but I guess Governor Ritter first. As we see battery storage scale, we also have concerns here in the US about safety, but also supply chains, making sure that these batteries are made responsibly. How are you thinking about that issue and how we scale energy storage, since it's such a critical piece, I think, of getting to net zero?
Yes, I think that's right. And I think we don't want to pose a question that's hydrogen versus batteries. I think, when I asked that question of a scientist in our symposium, he said, no, it's everything. We have to actually do all of this. And we don't know that one thing's going to be the answer and not the other. But on the battery side, there's a lot of innovation happening, and even at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, but also at Colorado State University, where people are looking at different options from the lithium-ion battery and things that do not involve necessarily even rare earth materials. We have an inorganic chemist investigating using nanotechnology for the build out of batteries. And she's probably a ways away from a solution. But she has a company that she's developed, and there's those kinds of things are happening and give us some hope. On hydrogen, it's pretty interesting. We had the leading scientist for the Environmental Defense Fund at our meeting, and he said we have to be a little careful about overselling hydrogen. The costs involved in creating it, if you create it even with renewables, the electrolysis is still fairly expensive, but there are still other kinds of greenhouse gas issues associated with creation of hydrogen. So it is not a panacea for all things in the future to replace like natural gas, even if you had the right material and pipelines. And so I think it has a role, hydrogen does, but it's not the thing. We shouldn't shut down investigating other innovations in favor of hydrogen. We should still continue to research what it's about and do the same with batteries and with storage. There are other kinds of storage beyond battery storage. Our former Secretary of Energy, Stephen Chu, who's a Nobel laureate, was on webinar that I was on talking about pump back storage, where you have, a hydro plant and you let it flow when the energy demand is the most, and when it's the least, you pump it back up hill, and you have that kind of a mechanism. But that's actually the cheapest storage mechanism right now. They're hard to build. They can be environmentally sensitive. There aren't a lot of people who want to build it because you have to build it in sometimes very pristine places. But it's interesting that we shouldn't foreclose other kinds of storage that are not necessarily battery storage and don't necessarily involve the same kinds of technologies or the same kinds of material science in getting to the place of having a storage solution.
So tailored solutions, I'm hearing. We need it all, but it sounds like it'll also be, we've got to be specific to where we are, the geography we're working in, exactly what the application is. Great. I will go back to that question that I put out as we're talking about storage and how it fits into this. Dr. Kim, what would you say to the question about how the battery fires affected South Korea's thinking on battery storage going forward?
Yeah, the problem of the fired battery is very complicated matters which were affected by the many things. One of the reasons that the battery was fired a lot is the past subsidy scheme of lithium-ion battery in the South Korea. South Korean government applied on the daily operation of storage without considering the real-time situation. So it caused unnecessary operation of storage. So it resulted in very extreme situation in terms of battery lifetime. So it is one of the reason of the battery fire. So the Korean government is now preparing another subsidy scheme for the future electric storage, and considering including any other type of storage like the hydro pump and the hydrogen storage, and also the gravity storage. So the changes in thinking is from the big failure of our past subsidy scheme. So the Korean government is trying to design the new subsidy scheme, consider the more safety and the more reliable operation of the storage. Yeah.
Great. All right, I'll take another question kind of branching out here, and it's asking, how can international trade generally and specifically between the US and South Korea help us meet our climate goals? There have been discussions broadly about border adjusted carbon pricing and carbon taxes. Is that something that we see playing in here? Hal, I'll go to you first.
So there's a lot of conversation, especially in Europe now, about border adjusted taxes. And it's because of the embedded carbon. If you have an inefficient steel mill, for example, not surprisingly, exporters of steel don't love this idea. The way to get around it is to produce the most carbon-free, the most lowest carbon steel you can. So there's a political conversation, but there's also a technology conversation. I think as a general rule, supply chains are going to insist on ever cleaner products. If you think of Apple doing so much manufacturing in China, but then insisting on certain labor standards, environmental standards for aluminum, toxic waste standards. And it's an interesting conversation because Apple needs China and China needs Apple. And this is negotiated outside the realm of policy, inside the realm of commerce. So it's one thing when you're just carving out a little aluminum shell for your iPhone. It's quite another when you're selling huge ships full of steel or something like that. So I guess I think it's inevitable there will be border tax adjustments. They will hurt some companies quite a bit. The way to avoid them is to be in the front quartile of performance, the top quartile of performance on all your export dependent goods, whether it's a car or steel or fertilizer or whatever. Because then you're not going to be hurt by border tax adjustments, and in fact, you'll gain market share. I guess what I'm saying is the right policy, and this is important, the right policy creates a race to the top. There are a lot of policies that do this. There are also policies that create a de facto ceiling, and we have to avoid those.
Dr. Kim, would you like to add on to any of that on international trade before we move on?
Yeah. I think the carbon border adjustment mechanism is related to the international trade in the South Korean perspective. It means the leveling the playing field consider the carbon emission in the production process. The many Korean companies feel very sad about this introduction of this kind of mechanism by the EU or the United States. But I think it would be very good opportunity in competing other East Asian company like the companies China and companies Japan, because we have a good capability to decarbonization of the industrial sector compared to the other East Asian countries. So yeah, and this kind of changes in international trade may be the trigger for the Korean government to think about the more progressive policies for the decarbonization of industry sector.
I'm curious to follow up on that, Dr. Kim, of what's motivating the transition in Korea. Is it coming from, everyday citizens who are demanding change? Is it coming from international pressure, kind of following on from this discussion? Are the investors getting involved and demanding companies change and decarbonize? I'm very curious to know what the driving forces are, both accelerating the transition to net zero in Korea and maybe holding it back.
Yeah, I think it's just in my opinion. I think that some people in the high profile level affect many aspects in the current policy on the net zero transition. And this is from the civil society. So there are a lot of demand from the civil society to make the changes in our energy policy and environmental policy. Also, it is more clarified by the international trends and the pressure on the changes.
Got it. Governor Ritter, I'm curious to bring this in the current context. We are emerging from a pandemic. I mean, we still are in a global pandemic. Of course, the Biden administration has put forward a big, bold infrastructure plan. They have climate goals. I know you've talked about in the past how the American Recovery Act helped accelerate the energy transition. Another motivating factor right now is just to reboot the economy and use maybe clean solutions on that front. So what are some of the maybe lessons learned in the US from the past that are applicable today, especially in this moment as we seek to, again, jolt the economy while we decarbonize?
I think I'd like to talk about two lessons I think we could say we've learned. One is a lesson from COVID, because the United States, if you think about the pandemic, as tragic as it was, responded fairly quickly with the development of different vaccines, actually 3 different vaccines, all of which were developed in about less than a year's time. And while that seems like that was very rapid, all the scientists who work in this field will tell you, we started that many years ago. We didn't start developing those vaccines or the science necessary to do that when January or February of 2020, when we first saw that the pandemic was headed our way, or March, when the United States got to a place of shutting down. We've been doing that work. And that's why we need to do the work now. The innovation, the kind of research, the development, the thinking about getting to net zero has to be now, because we will get to a place where the same type of urgency that attached to the pandemic will attach to the climate crisis. There's so much about it that is already urgent, but it will become exponentially more urgent if we don't act now. So that's I think, the number one thing that I would say about that. And then the second thing, the lessons from the Recovery Act, it is a massive infusion of government spending. But this is at a time where there's also going to be a massive infusion of private spending in the power sector, in the automobile sector. And I would argue the companies in the industrial sector that we're talking about that are the biggest companies, if you look at the biggest cement companies, they're presently trying to understand how they can innovate inside of their industry, keep their competitive edge, but get to a place where they're reducing their emissions. Because they have to in Europe, they have to in the United States, they have to in the biggest countries around the world, they'll have to in the Republic of Korea. It's only to their benefit to do that. So that's another capital infusion from those sectors, but utility sector, transportation sector for sure, industrial sectors for sure. And then you put on top of that a massive infusion of capital from the government sectors. And what we experienced in the Recovery Act was a real ability to kickstart an economy that was in a recession at the time, in what we called the Great Recession, and build out in a very sort of structured way. I think the only thing different about this from the Recovery Act is its size. And secondly, that we're going to use an environmental justice and an equity lens different than we had in the Recovery Act.
Yeah, I may put that to Hal as well, of seizing this current opportunity to accelerate the economy. And I liked the governor's point about making sure it's a just transition. And I'd like to bring it back to Korea on that front too. But what are some of the interesting ways you're seeing that enter the conversation in the US in a real way? And I want to just clarify, just transition for both communities that are reliant on coal today that are transitioning, but also communities that have been left behind in the transition to clean thus far.
Well, and there's one more element as well. Let me start with the third, which is the communities that have suffered from fossil fuel burning. You know, if you spend time with asthmatic kids in the Central Valley, or you know, leukemia ward in LA, you can see. Well, you know this as well as anyone, Julia. You can see quite distinctly the impacts of fossil fuel burning. So there's a set of benefits that, if properly targeted, can come right away to the populations. I mean, China's smog, we've all spent time in Beijing's worst days. In terms of the workers, you know, there are tensions between renewable energy jobs and old fossil fuel jobs. One of them is coal miners are paid very well and they're typically unionized. Solar installers earn less money and they're typically not unionized. So there's many more clean energy jobs in America now than there are conventional fossil energy jobs in America, but not everyone wants to or can switch. I think what this is going to require, there's an amazing opportunity right now. The United States is gearing up for the biggest financial incentive program ever, certainly the biggest since the Great Depression, even scaled for inflation. And in that is the opportunity to take care of the roughly 50,000 coal miners in America, to bolster their pensions, to make sure they have sufficient health care, but also to think about jobs that are in their communities. This is absolutely crucial. So environmental restoration. If you've got polluted streams because you've dozed overburdened from coal in there, clean them up, replant, put in irrigation systems. Those are good blue-collar jobs. They could be high-paying jobs, and you know what? We kind of owe it to those communities. They've powered America for 150 years. Let's give something back besides a despoiled landscape. There's a need for infrastructure. I'm thinking of West Virginia in particular as an example. It's a rural, mountainous, hard to access state with very little broadband, very few job and economic opportunities, incredible dependence on drugs now. There's an opportunity to help that state rebuild itself. It has to be driven by the leaders from the states. Absolutely crucial point. But there's a moment to have federal finance pour into these conversations in ways that never has happened before.
Wish we just valued things a little differently, right? Like we valued the jobs, but if we valued the clean air and water just as much, we'd find a way to make those jobs happen there too. I guess, Dr. Kim, how would you answer that from the Korean perspective on the workers? And as you're thinking about the transition away from coal, is the government or civil society thinking about where those jobs go? Is there a plan for that, a just transition in Korea?
Yeah, I think unfortunately the just transition is not the major issues in the Korean net zero transition until now, but it is very critical point for our future because around 70% of the market share of the generation sector is dependent on the conventional industry, including the coal and the gas. So if we omit this part, just transition, we lose many things for our society. But it is not there is not the official and the sound discussion on this just transition until now.
I'm going to go to another question here. Okay, let's see. The U.S. West Coast states are interested in floating offshore wind, which is pre-commercial. Is that of interest in Korea? And is there an opportunity for the U.S. and Korea to collaborate on that? So maybe Dr. Kim, I'll go to you first. Floating offshore wind.
Floating offshore wind. Yeah, I have not many knowledge on the floating offshore wind. Sorry.
No, that's fine. Hal, do you have any thoughts on that one specifically?
I think it's the next big trend. You can't put offshore wind in California right now unless it floats because the ocean floor is too deep. So it dramatically expands the opportunities. And there are commercial offshore floating wind now. It's just early days. I can't remember who makes them, but I think they're planning on doing their first ones in California soon. You know, I'm a junkie for cost reduction curves or learning curves or price curves. And when you deploy, you learn. And when you learn, you make things better, cheaper, more reliable. And then you keep going. But in the early days, you have to prime that pump. And I think we should have stronger incentives, stronger tax credits for offshore wind than for onshore wind. Alternatively, the utilities could pay a different price for onshore versus offshore. Not because they want it to be long-term more expensive, just the exact opposite, because they want them to become cheaper through deployment. But I predict floating offshore wind will become a huge business in the next 10 to 15 years.
I guess, Governor Ritter, I know you have the state perspective, but I'm curious from the US side, how important is Congress in this? Of course, Democrats control both houses right now, but it's a narrow majority in the Senate. So I'm just wondering, as we think about the big Biden plans, and again, recognizing states have a lot of input here too, but on the national level front, how do we see some of these visions and goals implemented, given that gridlock is still very much a thing?
We talked about how important states were to the electricity sector, the power sector, the built environment, to energy efficiency policies, even where it relates to industrial emissions. But we didn't talk about the fact that over the last 4 years, there was not a federal partner, and that lost time when the Trump administration was actually hostile to it, did great damage to our efforts in the United States to address this issue. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Methane is a terrible climate forcer. And a lot of the methane rulemaking can happen at the state level, but there are a lot of places where the states don't have great rules on capturing methane in the action process for oil and gas. There were federal rules, both an EPA rule and a Bureau of Land Management, Department of Interior rule, and we lost those rules. We lost the enforcement of those rules. And so we had a forcing greenhouse gas that was allowed to escape really without the kind of enforcement we need. And it did great damage. And, you know, recapturing that time frame is going to be tough. On the vehicle side, the Obama administration had fuel economy standards. They agreed with the automotive industry. The Trump administration decided they were going to sue California to try and remove the waiver. And in removing that waiver, there would have been 10 other states at zero emitting vehicle standards, 25 states that had low emitting vehicle standards. And if you're greater than the EPA and you lose the waiver, you do great damage to the state effort to get beyond where the EPA was, and the EPA stalled. So, you know, in places where you have great greenhouse gas emissions forcing climate, and you have the federal government either pushing back like they did on methane or trying to litigate like they did with the states, it really stopped the conversation on fuel economy at the federal level. And it caused automakers to sort of, I think, stall in their own innovation on how to get to where they needed to get to 2025, 2030, and 2035. The federal government in the United States of America has to be a partner if we're going to win this. It's important for states and locals and private sector to do it, but we will not get where we need to get to without a willing federal partner.
Hal, I love your thoughts on that briefly as we close out here, but I'll add the other audience question here about introducing a national price on carbon. So your thoughts on US national leadership or lack thereof and how things are changing, and would a price on carbon be something that would help here, and do you see it happening?
We have a president who is wholly committed to doing the right thing on climate change. We have a reluctant Congress, or a complicated Congress. I think we're going to get an infrastructure package through that is an amazing accelerant. And I think the U.S. regulatory policy will unfold as well after the stimulus bill passes. So we have that partner right now. We need to make use of every second of every minute of every day of the Biden presidency to make things happen. Remind me, Julia, your other question?
About
Do you see a
carbon
national
pricing.
price on carbon?
So carbon pricing is useful in some sectors. It doesn't make much of a difference in others. An example, it makes very little difference in housing because the people that design and build houses never pay the utility bills inside the house. So why should they spend a lot of extra money wrapping the ducts or doing a perfect job sealing the windows and so forth? It has a pretty nominal effect in transportation because gasoline is a diminishingly small part of our transportation budget. It can help with industry if there's an option to do something differently, fuel switch, change production facilities or whatnot. I think it's useful, but I don't think it's a magic elixir. And I think the Venn diagram of what the climate needs and what pricing can achieve may have very little crossover.
Great.
And I do think just can amplify the conversation now in the United States Congress. It looks like it may have some bipartisan wings is around a clean electricity standard that would have some trading possible in that to get the electric sector. Now it's just only the power sector.
It's really powerful.
I think that what we don't want is to have this false conversation about cap and trade versus a carbon tax, and we get neither when we have an opportunity to get a bipartisan solution to clean electricity or a clean energy standard.
Agree.
So Dr. Kim, I'll go to you to close us out here, and then maybe I'll give the Consul General the final word. But first to you, Dr. Kim, what would we be looking for from Korea going forward? You've laid out some of the goals. You mentioned these are not formalized. What should be on our calendars, on our radar, as we think about the steps Korea will take going forward?
Sorry, can you say again?
I'm wondering what we should be watching for in the weeks and months ahead out of Korea. I understand the pieces are set up. There are broad goals. Do you anticipate legislation moving? Do you anticipate these goals becoming formalized? What should we be watching for?
I think the first that we have to watch is the legislation of the carbon neutrality, the fundamental law. It forces the government to achieve the carbon neutrality goal at 2050 in the law. And the next thing we have to watch, we have to monitor is that the newly updated NDC target of the Korean government in this year. The Korean government are investigating about it, how we can reduce more compared to our original NDC target. That is the 2 points that we have to watch in this year.
Great. And then Consul General Yoon, I'll give you the final word to close us out this evening.
Thank you very much. United States has been a strong ally to Korea for more than 70 years since the Korean War. And as you know, there are many areas for our two countries to cooperate with each other. And I think the green area is a top priority for Korean government. And Korean economy has been transformed from more fossil fuel-based economy to more green growth economy. And the Korean government and the Korean businessmen is very much focusing on the new technology, including the batteries and electronic cars and the hydrogens and also the many renewable energies, including the solar panels. So in that sense, because Korea is one of the strong manufacturing countries, we can cooperate with each other, with the United States. And the US has a technology and they have a design capability and high-tech R&D centers. And Korea has a manufacturing capability and big business who can produce a lot of high-end the renewable energy products. So in that sense, we can cooperate with each other. And then I hope that this webinar could give us some guidance and directions for audience to think about how to cooperate with each other. And one question I received from the audience in the chatting the box is that whether the Korean government is strongly support the additional investment by Korean battery makers in the United States. So I think the Korean government has no objection to for Korean companies to make more investment in the US, especially the battery areas. Korean government believe that the battery is a new economic growth area. And then we are very much focusing on the in this sector as well. So because we have now there is a settle down between two Korean companies, LG Chemical and SK Innovation, so dispute, then I think we Korean big companies would like to have more investment in US in the near future. So I hope that this kind of environment and attitude can be applied to other sectors as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I think we will leave the conversation there. Thanks to everyone who attended and Energy Innovation for hosting, as well as the consulate. Thanks all very much.
Thank you,
Julia.
Julie.